A young man sweats nervously, breathing hard and confused. He looks around his surroundings and finds himself enclosed all around by rocks, and the only thing with him was a large blue orb in the middle of the room. His eyes widen in panic as he realizes that he's been buried alive. The man, Madara Metakashi, was someone who loved gambling. As such, he had a slight idea as to why he was buried alive in the first place. A few days back, he had been hired by the Yakuza, basically the Japanese mafia, for a bet and won big. He won with a perfect hand and the loan sharks he beat lost huge because of him. Now stuck wherever he was, he almost couldn't believe that they would go that far just because of something like that. It wasn't like killing him would get them a single yen back. He approaches the large glowing orb in the room with him, curious what it was. The moment he was within range, words appeared on the orb's surface, greeting someone called the Dungeon Master. Matarame was both confused and in disbelief, wondering if it was for some sort of game. He reaches out a finger and touches the orb's surface. Immediately the words on the screen change and a sort of menu appears, replacing the greeting from before with multiple options. Matarame is rather surprised that the orb appeared to be some sort of touchscreen mechanism. He was presented with choices such as Dungeon Create, Monster Create, Item Create, and Object Create. He didn't understand any of it, but seeing as there was nothing else for him to do, he figured he would just touch things around and see what happens. He ends up clicking the first option and blinks in surprise. He's presented with a sudden diagram. It was a human within a dome next to a circle object of almost equal size. Matarame realizes it was supposed to reflect his current situation. He wonders what would happen if he tugged on the dome shaped around him, and so he reaches out a finger towards the screen once more. He tugs on the dome, making the shape stretch before letting it go. As a tear seems to form from the dome at the same time, Matarame flinches and exclaims in surprise as he hears a loud crack come from behind him. He whips his head around and gapes in shock to see that a large hole had appeared in the ceiling. He wonders if it suddenly appeared just because he messed with the diagram on the orb. A nervous smile appears on his face as he slowly tries to piece together what everything could mean. The menu with an option to create a dungeon and the orb greeting him as the Dungeon Master. Matarame comes to the conclusion that he was meant to build a dungeon. However, things weren't so simple for him to call it just a simple game. He figures that with the power presented to him, he would be able to get out of his current problem. For now, he would play along with the game. Zooming out of the small diagram of his dome, Matarame is shown a better view of the world which was supposedly outside. If the ceiling was 2 meters high and based on the rest of the miniature, then above ground was most likely 30 meters up from where he currently was. Looking at the surroundings above ground, he sees a mountain and some trees, and comes to the conclusion that he was stuck somewhere in the base of a mountain. His finger ghosts over a certain part of the orb's diagram. Seeing the high walls, he realizes it was supposed to be a town. Zooming in, he finds that the level of civilization appeared more medieval as their mode of transport were carriages. Thankfully, there were people all over. Matarame realizes that wherever he was at the moment, it was probably not the world he was originally from. Judging from his current situation in the orb, it seemed to be a fantasy world. If he was to believe what was written on the orb, he was currently known as a Dungeon Master. Despite the name, however, he didn't know what that meant to the current world. After all, looking back at the menu on the orb, he had the ability to create monsters. Matarame concludes that his first order of business was to confirm the extent of his abilities. Monsters sounded too dangerous for him, so for now he chose item creation. He decides to start off with a sword. A list of materials appear before him such as copper, steel, mithril, and adamantite. It was the material in which to make the sword from. If the entries were ordered by rarity and strength, Matarame sees that orichalcum was the highest metal. He chooses to try and make an orichalcum sword, but an error message appears. Apparently he didn't have enough points and the orb tells him he needed over 100 million points to create one. Tinkering more with the settings, Matarame realizes that he has the ability to adjust performance, shape, and even add magic. Matarame finally chooses to create a default iron sword worth 10 points. Holding out his arms excitedly, the sword in question materializes right in front of him. Matarame excitedly holds it out, eyes glittering as he wonders in amazement what happened to the law of conservation of mass, which is basically the idea that matter is neither created nor destroyed in a closed system. To put simply, a sword materializing in midair just broke that very law. Matarame suddenly turns bashful as he realizes how he's been acting and tells himself that he didn't have the time to do all that. After experimenting more with the item create option, Matarame was able to get a grasp on the basics of it. Daily items were rather cheap, such as tissue paper only costing him 2 points and food and tea 1 point each. However, more imaginative creations were more expensive. Some items were also difficult to create. For example, a whole car cost 10 million and gasoline was 1,000,000 points. Petroleum products were too expensive while wood and iron products were cheaper. He figured that petroleum products probably didn't exist yet. Matarame wonders if it was a restriction to prevent mass production of artifacts. However, there were loopholes. Thin glass or pure white paper could be made relatively cheaply, costing around 15 points. It meant that if the object already existed in the world, it was cheap to recreate using his abilities, no matter the technology and effort it took to make it. For object creation, he even had the ability to create treasure chests and traps, their costs ranging from 15 to 80 points each. He also learned that he was able to copy things cheaply. For example, if he was to duplicate a chest worth 15 points, the copy would only cost him 10 points. Not only that, he could even create areas with magma or forests. However, creating such areas was expensive. The running cost makes indiscriminate placement rather risky. He frowns as he faces his next problem, the option for monster creation. Upon choosing it, he's presented with options on the bestial form it would take. Even the cheapest dragon type costs 50,000 points. It was half of the current points he currently owned, so there was no way he could create one at the moment. Messing around more of the settings, he finds that he's also able to alter the monster's abilities too, such as skill levels. He could even edit their reproduction rates. If Matarame was honest, he was finding it all a bit too much to handle. Skin toughness, claw sharpness, and even the ability to give them poison stingers or sacks. Trying to find out more, Matarame chooses the abilities of a mouse-type monster. It appeared to him that there was a correlation in the stats. For example, mouse types could boost agility cheaply, but boosting strength or vitality costs a lot more. Large type forms could easily increase strength, but they found it hard to increase agility. Matarame thought it made sense since it would be weird if a mouse had the strength of an elephant. With an amused smile, Matarame liked the idea of being able to do it once he invested enough points on it. Monsters could also be given certain skills such as poison stingers, fire breath, intelligence, and lightning magic classes. There was also something called an aura combat style level. The deeper the color goes, moving from yellow to orange, then red, the stronger it becomes. It was a little fun fact that made the Chunibu part of him pleased. Basically, his delusions of grandeur were acting up. Maybe because it was the kind of system you only see in video games and such. But there were limits to skill enhancement too, so it wasn't exactly easy to make overpowered monsters. Having seen enough, Matarame finally decides to test it out. Swallowing hard, he prays that he doesn't get attacked by the monsters he was going to create. Eventually, as a safety measure, he decided to create a very weak creature. With thin legs like wires and a small, round body covered in fur, Matarame smiles nervously to himself. He hopes it shouldn't be able to attack him. Its stats would be at the bare minimum, costing only 1 point. Matarame was assured that its stats could be adjusted later, and he was only losing a point if it ended up dying from being too weak. Choosing all the necessary options, he waits for the orb to create the monster, but instead another message pops up. Apparently, since it was his first time making a monster, he could give it an intelligence skill with a class level of 10. Matarame blinked in surprise. Weak monsters generally had low intelligence. The maximum level of a skill was 10, but once it exceeded 4, the monster already had the ability to communicate. Matarame figured it was a first-time reward for him to create an assistant. Now that he thought about it, he knew he couldn't create anything he didn't understand. The higher-ups who trapped him there seemed really eager to have him create a dungeon. Seeing he didn't have many other options, he decides to follow their intentions for him for the time being and enhances his new monster with intelligence. A ball of fur materializes in front of him. Just as he wanted, it had stick-width legs and a small face. Matarame watched as it got up before tripping and falling flat on its face. He crouched down and asked if it could talk properly. Standing back up, it trots up to Matarame and thanks him for creating it. Matarame introduces himself before naming the tiny monster as Kerama. Kerama thanks Matarame for bestowing it a name. With introductions out of the way, Matarame asks Kerama to explain the concept of a dungeon master to him. Kerama tells him that a dungeon master was meant to protect the orb, which was known as the dungeon core. The dungeon core lured humans from outside, killed them, and absorbed the overflowing mana from their bodies to expand the dungeon. Matarame frowned at the idea of killing, but he tries to move on and asks about mana. Kerama explains that it was the energy inherent in living beings. The dungeon core was a device that collected mana from surrounding creatures and converted it into points. Matarame asks the purpose of the system, but Kerama doesn't know. However, Kerama says that the final goal was for Matarame to accumulate 100 billion points. The first dungeon master to achieve 100 billion points becomes ruler of the world. Matarame says it was quite the big dream, but with a glint in his eyes, he agrees that they should aim for the goal. Following Kerama's suggestion, Matarame's first order of business was expanding the cramped space and installing lighting. He also hung wallpaper and placed a table and chairs, making it look like a proper room. Sitting down on the main armchair and setting down Kerama on the table, Matarame asks how to get 100 billion points. The furball tells him that there were 3 ways to gain points. The first was to kill humans. Kerama tells him to target strong humans. Humans could accumulate more mana the more they trained, sort of like experience points in a game. However, stronger humans adventurers would come to destroy the dungeon core. Destroying the dungeon core meant the death of the dungeon, and ultimately the death of the dungeon master. Matarame frowned as he thought about his chances. The stronger the adventurer, the higher the points, but it also meant it had greater risks. Eventually, it all boiled down to how he managed the risks. Kerama continues and says that the second method was to absorb from plants and animals around the dungeon. However, this method only got him about 10 points per day, and for the third method, it was to absorb mana from humans but without killing them. Kerama says that humans had more abundant mana compared to other plants and animals. An average-level adventurer staying in the dungeon for about an hour could get Matarame around 10 points of mana. Matarame asks how many points he would get if he killed the average adventurer, and Kerama tells him it would be about 10,000 points, making it 1,000 times more than if he simply absorbed their mana. Matarame realizes that to get 100 billion points he would have to sacrifice more than 100 million people. He says that it would be impossible since there weren't even around 100 million people around there. He asks what would happen if he captured humans and imprisoned them without killing them, but Kerama says that it would be difficult. Mana was the energy of life and was released more when emotions were heightened. Adventuring in dungeons was what produced high-quality mana. Kerama offers that imprisonment and torture could create emotional fluctuations, but Matarame quickly says that he didn't want to do that. Kerama says that he didn't recommend it either because humans wouldn't leave such a dangerous dungeon alone. Not only that, Matarame couldn't create an absolutely unbreakable dungeon either. Matarame is confused by what it means. After all, he could create a door that was completely separated from the dungeon core and cannot be opened. He could even make one with a ton of traps and monsters, or even one with poison gas filling the entire floor to kill. Kerama shoots his ideas down, saying that he must ensure that the dungeon could be cleared because it was in the dungeon rules. Matarame is confused to hear about something called the dungeon rules, and Kerama explains that it was regulations he must follow when building a dungeon. Matarame exclaims in disbelief, asking who made such rules. Kerama repeats that he couldn't answer because he didn't know. Although annoyed, Matarame orders Kerama to tell him about the dungeon rules. First of all, the entrance must be connected to the dungeon core via a passage. Matarame asks if he could make a passage too small for humans, but Kerama says that passage dimensions were regulated as well. He could add doors and locks, but the key item to open them must be placed in a treasure chest on the same floor. It also wasn't allowed to make puzzles with ceiling doors with absolutely unsolvable codes. The puzzle must be fair and solvable by at least 6 out of 10 people. Matarame leans back on his chair and groans, saying that the rules were way too generous. Kerama says that even trap placement areas were meticulously regulated. Matarame complained that there were nothing but restrictions and he couldn't cheat at all. In other words, he had to follow the dungeon rules. Thinking deeply, Matarame thinks that probably any obvious loopholes have already been closed. However, stuff like item creation had loopholes of its own, so dungeon creation must have some too. Choosing to move on for the moment, Matarame asks about monsters. Kerama explains that monster placement also required attention. Basically, monsters had their own thoughts and moved on their own as well. They were hostile to humans and would attack without being ordered to. However, if their intelligence level was too low, they might wander off or escape. Matarame comments that it would be a big loss for him if the monsters he created escaped. Kerama continues that although locked doors could help, monsters could also trigger traps. If he were to place one near a trap, Kerama suggests using monsters immune to those traps. For example, he could use a slime in a pitfall. However, most veteran adventurers could guess traps from monster types, such as the ground being suspicious if there were many flying-type monsters going around. Kerama says that the most difficult thing was securing water and food for the monsters, making Matarame exclaim in shock that he had to watch out for that too. Kerama explains that the biggest reason monsters left the dungeon was their lack of food. Some monsters had high reproduction rates such as slime. Strong monsters would multiply on their own if left unattended. Kerama suggests that Matarame should increase the number of weaker monsters and use them as food. Matarame basically had to make an entire ecosystem for them. The strong monsters needed a low reproductive rate and weaker monsters should have a higher reproductive rate. He asks if other dungeon masters really had to go that far. Kerama says that he was there to assist him with such tasks. Matarame asks if he could create skeletons or zombies instead since they didn't need food. Kerama says that skeletons were cheap and revived over time even if they were defeated. but it didn't recommend them. However, it agrees that having a few around was convenient, so they should create some. His words make Matarame more confused. Finally summoning a skeleton, it swings a sword around over and over. Matarame gapes in disbelief. Kerama explains that skeletons had no other attack methods. Similarly, golems or puppet-type monsters could only do simple actions. Matarame could teach them, but it would take time. Not only that, skeletons also had many weaknesses. Clerics' exorcism attacks, holy water blessed by priests, and even simple traps were like tripwires to them. Pointing to the skeleton still animatedly waving its arm around, Matarame asks what Kerama meant when it said that they were convenient. Kerama explains that dungeon masters could possess and operate skeletons. Matarame realizes that they would be useful if deployed in a dungeon, but still they were fairly useless. Matarame finally asks how many dungeons survived adventurer attacks and made it to their second year. There's a pause, and Kerama says that it would be around 30%. Matarame seems surprised by the news. He changes subjects again and asks what Kerama knew about the town nearby. The monster says that about an hour's walk west was the fortress city of Roadlock. There were approximately 70,000 citizens and thrived as a trading town. Thinking deeply about it, Matarame realizes it was a larger count than he expected. As a trading town, people, money, and goods should be flowing in and out. If bandits appeared seeking loot, merchants would need skilled guards, meaning the fortress city had a decent number of adventurers as guards. Matarame frowns thoughtfully to himself. Time passes and an adventuring party makes its way down the mountainside. One of the magic users of the group named Melinda stops walking and turns with concern towards something behind her. One of her party members asks what was wrong, and she says that she felt strange mana coming from a certain mountain. The man turns to their other party members, Tref and Ciel, and asks what they thought, but the other two weren't able to feel it. A man holding a battle axe just tells the man Kaito to ignore it and they should just go home. However, another party member tells the one holding an axe to wait. She points out that Melinda's hunches were usually right, so they should go check it out. Kaito tells Gantz, the man with the battle axe, that they would go check out the mountain's base, and if there was nothing, then they would turn back. The group heads on over and finds the entrance of a dungeon. Melinda's hunch was spot on. Kaito asked the rest of the group if they didn't feel anything when they passed by that same area 2 days ago, but there was nothing. Kaito smiles, knowing that it meant that it was only created yesterday or today. He comments that it was like it was begging to be cleared. They enter and reach a set of 2 large doors, pushing it open. However, upon seeing what was inside, Kaito exclaims in disbelief. A day or so back, Matarame tells Kerama that a normal dungeon would be cleared immediately, making it a dead end for him. In that case, he would let the adventurers clear something else. With a sly grin, Matarame announces that he would make a casino dungeon. It was the very one that Kaito and his party found. Back in the Roadlock Adventurers Guild, a voice exclaims in disbelief to hear that the rumor was true. Kaito stays quiet as he waits for the Vice Guild Master Paulette to say something else. Paulette massages her temple as she thinks about how the Guild Master was absent, and now they had a problem. Paulette asks what a casino dungeon even was. It was a dungeon without monsters or traps. However, Kaito says that it was definitely a dungeon. He thinks back on when they first entered it. Heading deeper into the casino, Melinda's eyes sparkle at the sight of the interior. Even one of the members, Askel, comments that it looked more like a palace. Gantz catches sight of strange-looking boxes marked as slot machines. As they explore more, Kaito reminds them to be careful in case of traps. Kaito gives the order for Askel to check for traps and for Melinda to check for magical traps. Suddenly, Seal calls out to them from a corner and says that there was a treasure chest outside the door. They find a box that says with a note that said that there was a grand opening sale. First-time visitors would receive 10 free coins. Gantz offers to open the chest. As mentioned, there were coins inside the chest. Gantz complained that the coins weren't exactly gold. Kaito argues that it was necessary for clearing the dungeon. Tref asks Kaito where they should check first. Kaito points to a set of 2 doors, saying that it would likely lead to the next floor. Gantz tries to open the door but finds that it wouldn't budge. Askel says that if Gantz's brute force couldn't force it open, then it wasn't going to work. Kaito points out that the sun and moon-shaped holes on the door must need something inserted. Tref comments that it was a common dungeon mechanism. Melinda finds another treasure chest somewhere in the room. However, upon opening it, it was empty. Tref finds a note on the bottom of the chest. It says that if they whispered the desired prize and inserted the required coins, the prize would be provided accordingly. They correctly assume that the coins needed were the ones they found from earlier. Seal points out a stone tablet on another corner of the room. At the very top of the list, written on the stone tablet, it says the sun and moon symbol cost 100,000 coins each. Seeing all the other options listed on the stone tablet, Kaito decides to try choosing a low-grade healing potion first. He inserts the necessary coins and closes the treasure chest. Upon opening it again, a potion bottle was inside, replacing the coins. He hands the bottle to Treff, asking him to appraise it. Muttering under his breath, Treff casts an analyze spell on the bottle. Treff tells Kaito that it was a genuine potion bottle, so now they knew that 200,000 coins could open the door. Seal realizes that another box was meant to be an exchange box. Reading a nearby note, Melinda exclaims in shock to realize that 1,000 Kraka silver coins, basically actual money, could be exchanged for 10 coins. It meant that they needed 20 million Kraka just to reach the next floor. Treff says that in the Fortress City, 100,000 to 150,000 Kraka covered monthly living expenses. Kaito was just as surprised to hear that the money needed to buy a house was just to descend one floor. Treff points out that the price of a low-grade healing potion was far from the usual city market prices. Roadlock sold them for 900 to 1,000 Kraka. He adds that higher value items had better exchange rates in the casino. While a high-grade potion normally cost 110,000 Kraka, here it was only 100,000. Kaito tells them that they should search for more hidden coins. They spread out to check the empty bar and underneath poker tables, but they couldn't find more. Eventually, they head to the slot machines, hoping it would help. Looking at the slots, Melinda wonders about the pictures. They seem to show cherries and grapes. Gantz points out that they could insert coins at a certain slot. Kaito urges them to insert one and he pulls the lever. Immediately, the slot machine bursts into life. Gantz asks Kaito worriedly if he was alright. Suddenly, Melinda comes up from behind Kaito, her chest pressed against his back, and asks if they should press one of the other buttons on the machine. Kaito warns her that it might not be safe, but it was too late, and Melinda presses it anyway. The slot machine slows to a stop and a line of cherries is formed. Coins tumble out from a slot underneath the machine. Melinda is confused by what just happened, but Kaito realizes that the slot machines were made to increase coins. He urges them to take coins of their own and try increasing them. Melinda is reluctant about wasting coins, but Kaito reasons that they didn't spend any initial capital anyway. They spend the rest of the time excitedly using their coins with varying reactions. And so finishing his report to Pollitt, Kaito says that it was a special but very fun and unusual dungeon. Pollitt looks at him unimpressed, hearing that he tried not to say that it was fun, but still he slipped. Pollitt says that if what Kaito says was true, then it was indeed an unusual dungeon. But if there were no monsters, then the danger was low. Kaito argues that the place required time to clear and many adventurers needed to go there. Not only that, but it was also close to Roadlock. Kaito continues to say that the guildmaster would definitely want the details. Pollitt says that she had no intention of showing Kaito favor just because he was the guildmaster's nephew. However, after a pause, Pollitt agrees to investigate the dungeon. She says that she would request an escort and guide from Kaito's party. Tomorrow morning, Kaito was to take her and the investigation team of 4 to the dungeon. Kaito was surprised to hear that Pollitt, who was the vice guildmaster, was coming too. Pollitt lets out a sigh of exasperation, admitting that the guild was currently short-staffed. Meanwhile, Kerama steps closer to the dungeon core. Matarame and Kerama were at the dungeon's lowest floor. Kerama comments that he had never imagined using a dungeon as a casino. Matarame is pleased by his clever idea. Kerama argues that they ended up with losses, but Matarame says that there was also an initial bonus, so next time they would be profitable. Kerama is worried that stronger adventurers would come, but Matarame argues that that was exactly the plan. They had to lure strong adventurers into the casino and collect their mana. Normally, if strong adventurers gathered in a dungeon, there was a risk of it being cleared, but the casino had no such concern. There were only a few points left, but Matarame says that they should start operating the next facility. Eventually, Kaito's party and Pollitt's team arrive at the dungeon. Looking around rather nervously, Pollitt says that it was rather unusual. There were no monsters visible, but she asked Kaito to guard the team until the investigation ended. Kaito tells himself it was time for him to work, and he forces himself to continue with the slots later. Seal notices that the box that had 60 coins yesterday now only had 50 inside. Treff points out that the note said the coins were limited to the first-time visitors, so the coins in the box were most likely meant for the 4 investigators and the vice guildmaster. Gantz cries out in dismay, hoping he could have the chance to play too. Kaito jokingly asks him if he should just exchange money for the coins, but from behind them, Melinda wears a scary expression, waiting for them to actually do it. Looking at the list of prizes on the stone tablet, Pollitt notices that there were a lot of empty spaces. She says that spending 200,000 coins just to open a door was impossible. Kaito adds that it would take forever, but Pollitt says that it was more likely that it would never be cleared. They couldn't exchange coins back to cash, but they could trade it for sellable items like potions. It meant that having 200,000 coins was like holding 20 million kraka. Thinking about her words, Melinda says that if she had 20 million kraka, she would just retire from being an adventurer. Kaito jokes that if they absolutely had to clear it, the guild would have to fund it. Pollitt immediately refuses, saying the guild couldn't afford 20 million. Moving on from the stone tablet, Pollitt tells Kaito to investigate the slot machines. He immediately jumps up at the chance and says that the best way to do it would be playing them. Melinda casts him an unimpressed look. Pollitt watches as Kaito plays a couple of rounds before exclaiming in victory. Eventually, Pollitt sighs in exasperation and tells Kaito to stop as she got the basic gist of it, much to Kaito's surprise. Pollitt explains that the bet amount differs depending on the slot machines. Gantz agrees, saying that while certain machines only needed 1 coin to play, another needed 10 coins. Waving a bag of coins around excitedly, Gantz says that the coins increased a lot, and Pollitt comes to the conclusion that the higher the bet they made, the better the payout would be. Kaito realizes with delay that yesterday, there weren't any slot machines with a high payout. Suddenly, Treff calls out to Kaito and asks if a certain path at the back was already there yesterday. They head to its opening and examine the surroundings. Asel, the one laying down the dungeon map, says that it certainly wasn't there the day before. Kaito tells her to map the expansion. He then orders the others to stay alert for monsters and traps while investigating. They enter the path and find a hallway lined with doors. Gantz notices that some doors were marked to be toilets. Kaito opens one of the doors to check. However, the moment he enters, he stops in disbelief at the grand space before him. Everything was sparkling clean and beautifully decorated. There was even a fountain in the middle of the room. Melinda exclaims that she's never seen such a clean restroom. Gantz was so shocked by the sparkling toilets that he said he could even eat there. Overtaken by excitement, Melinda tells Kaito that they should check the women's restroom next. Kaito comments again that there were no monsters in the restroom as Melinda continues to marvel at how clean everything was. Suddenly, Gantz calls out to Kaito from the next room over, telling him how amazing it was. Kaito flinches and lightly reprimands Gantz for not worrying about monsters, but his words are cut short when he enters the room. It was a bathroom with a large pool filled with hot water. Following close behind Kaito, Pollitt sighs again, wondering what she was going to report to the guildmaster. The rest of the investigation team enter the bathroom, saying that they needed to investigate thoroughly since traps might still exist. Kaito agrees that reporting was one thing, but the question was whether they should use it in the first place. Actions they made within the dungeon were at their own risk, but it was still so unusual. Suddenly, Melinda pops up from behind them and tells Pollitt that they should try the bath. Kaito immediately disagrees, saying that it was way too dangerous, but Melinda argues that they came to investigate whether it was dangerous or not anyway. However, in truth, she just wanted to try the bath. Much to Kaito's disbelief, Pollitt agrees to try out the bath. Askel brightens at her words, saying that Pollitt truly understood them. Seal smiles as well, saying that she wanted to try it out earlier. Kaito smiles sheepishly as he watches all the women in the group become united in their decision to try out the bath. Gantz suddenly comes up behind the group with a sleazy smile, saying that he would guard the women while they bathed. Immediately, Askel comes up behind him with a knife to his throat, asking if he wanted to be killed. Kaito begins to drag Gantz away before he's turned into fish food. Suddenly, one of the members of the investigation team came up to Pollitt, informing her that there was another strange box in the changing room. Kaito stops, curious about the box as well. Upon seeing the box, it says that it was an exchange box for soap. 1 coin provided a small soap, 5 coins gave a medium-sized soap, and 10 coins for a larger one. Seal urges the others to try it and asks for a coin from Kaito that he got from the slot machines. With a shaky hand, Kaito hands one over to Seal to exchange. Upon receiving it, she exclaims in delight at the amazing smell. With glittering eyes, Melinda asks Kaito for 5 more coins to try the medium-sized soap, and with shaking hands, Kaito hands it over to her. Comparing the sizes of the soaps, Melinda says that the 5-coin soap might be a better deal. Pollitt then asks 10 coins from Kaito for the last prize. Kaito forks it over, but he collapses in dismay to his knees to find that he only had a few coins left from his winnings. Exchanging the coins, Pollitt is surprised to find something different from soap in the box. It was a bottle of hair oil. With Melinda's urging, Pollitt uncorks the bottle and they're immediately invaded by a pleasant smell. Pollitt tells the rest of the girls that the oil was most likely from the south. She had smelled something like it before. It was a gift to the royal court. The rest of the girls start to chatter excitedly, wanting to exchange Kraka silver coins for more of the hair oil. Treff is surprised to hear that a gift to the royal court was basically being sold for a single silver coin. Kaito asks if they should buy the rest of the luxury goods. However, the women start groaning in dismay to find that they had sold out the items. Seal tells them that they should definitely buy more once it gets restocked. Pollitt orders Kaido, Gantz, and Treff out of the room as the women prepare to try out the bath. Gantz tries to complain, but Treff pushes him out. The women have fun with their bath, conversing and laughing amongst themselves. Meanwhile, the men are stuck outside, spending time at the slot machines. Gantz dreams about the idea of the women taking a bath at that moment, but Kaito tells him that if he kept going, he was going to get killed someday. Internally, Kaito couldn't help but wonder about how excited the women got simply because of baths and hair oils. Either way, it was because of that they could enjoy slot machines fully now. Some time passes and suddenly, Melinda's voice calls out to Kaito, apologizing for keeping them waiting. Fresh from the bath, Melinda approaches Kaito, her cheeks flushed from the water's heat. Kaito's eyes widen and he blushes at the sight of her. He forces himself to look away, noting that Melinda took a rather long bath. He asks her where Pollitt was, and she tells him that she was at the bar talking to the other women. Melinda says that the bath was great. It was her first time in a spacious bath, so it felt really wonderful. The soap smelled good too. As she points out the difference in her hair because of the oil, Kaito cuts her off and says that her hair looked great. Melinda's smile drops for a second, caught off guard before she grins brightly. Kaito quickly looks away again, turning back to the slot machines. Just as he thinks that it wasn't bad seeing Melinda in such a manner, he presses on the slot machine's button again. Suddenly, a line of angel symbols appear on the slot's reel. Melinda looks over Kaito's shoulder, amazed at the win. However, Kaito had never seen the angel icons beforehand. The exchange table didn't say how many angel symbols were a win, nor did any coins come out. Normally, it would be a line of cherries, watermelons, grapes, and bells. Kaito wondered if it was meant to signify a loss. But just as he thought so, the machine springs back to life, much to both Kaito and Melinda's shock. In quick succession, the slot reels showed a perfectly lined up sequence of cherries, bells, and then watermelons. Soon after, coins rained down from the prize slot. Watching the coins come pouring in, Melinda grabs hold of Kaito by the shoulders and shakes him in excitement. Kaito had never seen so many consecutive wins. He realizes that the angel symbol was merely a precursor. Trying to fight back an excited smile, he couldn't help but find playing the slot machine so crazy and fun. You know what else is crazy? Gaining a gambling addiction. Remember to be smart about your money, kids. Eventually, time passes and the day is all but done. From inside the dungeon, Gantz mourns that he lost again. He was winning until halfway through his time in the dungeon. Kaito points out it was because he spent more time on the slot machine that bets 10 coins. Gathering the group, Pollitt tells them that to end their investigation for the day, they were to exchange their coins for prizes. Looking at the prize board, Kaito finds hair oil among the options, which was worth 200 coins. He figured that with 200 coins he would be able to buy good food or new equipment. However, after some thinking, he ended up approaching Melinda with a bottle in hand. Melinda gapes at him surprised before taking the bottle. With glittering eyes, she realizes that it was a bottle of hair oil, which must have been rather expensive for him to obtain. Kaito tells her that he didn't have any other prize he wanted, so she should just take it. Melinda's face flushes and she awkwardly thanks him. They end up going quiet, embarrassed by the whole exchange. Unbeknownst to them, they were being watched. From his office, Matarame smiles at his great success. Kerama celebrates their huge profit. The hair oil was effective for them. Things that were rare in Roadlock cost them nothing to transport with the power of the dungeon core. Kerama says that Fever Time, the scenario in which the angel symbols appeared on Kaito's slot machine, was also a great reaction. Matarame agrees, saying that even he got hooked on something like that back then. However, their biggest win had to be the bath. Kerama thoughtfully says that he never knew women were that passionate about baths. Matarame admits that he thought it would have some effect, but it was even better than expected. Eventually, rumors would start spreading and attract more people. Helping Kerama settle atop his shoulder, Matarame tells it his plans. They would maintain the status quo for the meantime, accumulate more points, and then upgrade even further. Eventually, signs are put up on the announcement boards of the Adventurers Guild. A renovation for the casino dungeon would be coming soon. Time passes and the dungeon core's room is now Matarame's casino surveillance room. Somewhere inside, Matarame sits cross-legged on the floor with Kerama, poring over some documents on hand. Crawling underneath the table, Matarame asks Kerama how the surveillance monitors were doing. From over the table, Kerama lets him know that 2 of the monitors were unstable. Matarame quickly leaves the table and goes back to the instruction manuals in his hand, confused about how that happened. Kerama tries to reassure him that it would handle everything and Matarame should rest. Matarame laughs and tells him that he couldn't do that because they were already quite behind schedule. The casino's renovation grand opening would be happening in a few days, so they needed to finish it by then. Matarame had planned to spend more time on the renovations. However, his casino had attracted more people than expected and was completely over capacity. The slot machines were all full, and the exchange counters had long lines. Matarame knew it wouldn't be good if rumors about inconvenience started spreading. Turning to Kerama, Matarame says that despite things being tough, he urges the furball to keep working hard. Kerama excitedly agrees, saying that it was its duty to help him. Eventually, time passes. Kaito makes his way down a forest path. His strides are quick, but the rest of his party members are a lot slower than he is. At some point, Melinda calls out to him, saying that he was walking way too quickly. Kaito stops, apologizing for realizing too late. Melinda tells him that there was no need to hurry since the dungeon wasn't going to run away, but with a concerned look on his face, Kaito says that it might. With that, he turns back to the path, saying that the dungeon had already run off. Melinda sighs in exasperation, repeating that dungeons didn't just run off. With his back turned to the rest of the party, he lets his smile drop, a more serious expression taking place. Thinking about the casino's renovations, Kaito knew it would have to go through a transition period. Dungeons were said to be born. A person could tell a dungeon was alive because it was constantly changing passages and rooms. Major changes like floor reshuffling occasionally occurred. Adventurers referred to these major dungeon changes as transition periods. Kaito's walking grounds to a halt. Eventually, the rest of the party come up behind him, with Gantz asking how the dungeon has changed. Kaito doesn't tear his eyes away from the dungeon entrance. From being a small opening in the side of the mountain's base, it had grown to become a grand entrance styled like classical Greek architecture. Astel gapes with combined awe and terror, impressed and unable to believe that it was still the same casino dungeon. Treff was equally as impressed, noting that the dungeon had grown so fast that it was already a medium-sized dungeon. With a nervous look on his face, Kaito urges the party forward. They enter the dungeon with their weapons ready. When a transition period occurred, there was no telling how the dungeon had changed during that time. But internally, Kaito could only hope that the dungeon had not been ruined by weird renovations, since everyone loved the slot machines and the baths. They descend the staircase leading to the main casino, but stop short just before entering. Melinda's voice is shaky as she speaks up. Guarding the entrance of the casino were two skeletons on either side of the entrance. The party's faces are full of concern as they realize that monsters had finally appeared inside the dungeon. Without a moment to lose, Kaito calls out for battle positions. The others flinch in shock at his command for a second before holding up their weapons. In the next instant, Kaito is rushing forward, despite Melinda calling out to him in concern. He dashes up to the nearest skeleton, his sword poised to attack. He swings, but in the millisecond before his attack hits, Kaito realizes that the skeleton had made no move against him. Instead, it seems to take his attack head-on, and Kaito's sword cuts it clean in two. With the first one down, Melinda rushes forward to take care of the second skeleton. Holding out her staff, she casts a flame spell, aiming right for the monster. The skeleton catches fire and is burned to ashes almost instantly. The area is quiet once more, with all the monsters wiped out. Treff reminds Kaito that skeletons usually revive when hit with normal attacks, and so he asks him if he should purify them with exorcism magic. However, Kaito disagreed. He couldn't shake off the feeling that the skeleton he faced had no intention of fighting back with a counterattack. Handing out his final decision, he tells Treff to let them revive because he wanted to observe their behavior. They wait, and eventually the skeletons get back up. The party is shocked when the skeleton bows respectfully to them. Still, there was no sign of attacking. Gantz worriedly asks Kaito what they were going to do now. Kaito says that it was too early to conclude that they were harmless, but they needed to proceed and investigate. With that in mind, they head into the heart of the casino's main floor. Seal notes that the inside had changed quite a bit. Treff adds that it was about 4 times larger than before. Gantz happily announces that there were more slot machines now, so they didn't have to wait for the openings when the dungeon was filled like before. Melinda notes that there were skeletons placed all over the room too. Seeing as there was a skeleton on each table that was empty before, Kaito is rather unnerved at the idea that they were meant to play the games too. Asil suddenly calls out to Seal, pointing at a skeleton who was sweeping the floors. There was also a tavern and newly added restaurant, but it seemed to still be under preparation. Treff notices that the prize exchange box and the exchange counter are gone now. It was replaced by skeletons seemingly trapped behind bars. Kaito is unnerved again at the idea of having to exchange the prizes with the skeletons. Gantz is reassured that since the skeletons were behind bars, they didn't have to fear monster attacks. Kaito reasons that it was actually the opposite. Treff explains that before, the prizes were in a treasure chest so nothing could be done, but now they were displayed right in front of them, just behind the skeletons and placed on the shelves. Kaito finishes off the explanation by saying that by putting up bars, they were meant to prevent adventurers from attacking the skeletons. Melinda cuts into their conversation, wanting to check the bath already. They head on over and find that the number of restrooms has increased. Even the bath was 4 times larger. Some parts of the bath had vigorously bubbling foam. At the sight of it, Melinda squeals in delight, saying that they needed to tell Paulette when they got back to the guild hall. However, the most unusual room was one that was filled with intense steam and heat. Kaito exclaims in shock at the heat. Asel recognizes that the room was meant to be a sauna. She explains to Kaito that it was something she saw up north, and its purpose was to make anyone who stayed sweat. Kaito is confused because as far as he saw things, it was just a very hot room and wasn't much of a punishment. Asel explains that it would feel great to have a cold bath after. Kaito sighs in exasperation. There were rest areas in the corridors with baths and a new space called a lounge. There was another prize exchange box in the lounge, but it seemed like it could only exchange drinks and ice. But there was one more major change, a path pointed out by Gantz. Upon entering, they're greeted by a sign that said that a 3-person room cost 50 coins per night. Upon inserting the coins in the space provided, they would be given the room key. Kaito exclaims in shock to realize it was an inn. Melinda says that that was what happened during a transition period, but Kaito argues whatever happened to the casino dungeon had moved beyond a simple transition period. Deciding to complete the investigation, they insert a couple of coins on the door slot to check the rooms. They find a considerably small room with a 3-bed bunk. Gantz comments that he was expecting something more amazing, but Seal argues that when they had to stay in dungeons before, they weren't provided something as comfortable as that. Kaito starts to think that maybe using the casino's inn as a base would be convenient, but Melinda suddenly comes up behind him with an unimpressed look on her face. She asks him if he really wanted to play the slot machines that bad. Kaito immediately tries to defend himself, saying that it made accessing the Ironblood dungeon easier. The Ironblood dungeon was 2 hours from Roadlock, so it took 4 hours all in all for a round trip. If they could use the casino dungeon as a temporary base, they could focus on dungeon exploration. Melinda continues to stare him down, but she accepts his reasoning for the meantime, despite Kaito looking so suspicious. Kaito adds that despite the room being so small, 5,000 kraka for 3 people was a steal. Treff agrees since Roadlock's prices had recently increased, and even the cheapest inns charged 3,000 a person. Kaito says that despite how strange it was to say about a dungeon inn, using it as a base might even be safer. Melinda agrees, since cheap inns often had thieves stealing from guests. Kaito internally agrees that the scariest being around was a human. Kaito turns away from the room as they conclude that part of their investigation. The only place they haven't investigated was the tables with the skeleton standing over them. Gantz asks what they were going to do next, and Kaito offers to check it alone first. Melinda follows after him, worried that there might be traps. Upon reaching the table, the skeleton bows and welcomes them. Straightening up, it informs them that they were at a blackjack table and asks if they wanted to play. Kaito and Melinda freeze in shock. From behind them, Treff is unnerved at a skeleton with the ability to talk. The skeleton repeats its question, asking Kaito if he wants to play. Kaito is startled out of his shock and he nervously agrees. He remembers that he doesn't know the game or the rules, and so the skeleton offers to play without betting first. Holding up a deck of cards, the skeleton explains that blackjack was played using trump cards. Kaito notes that they had something similar in Roadlock. The skeleton continues, saying that Kaito's opponent would be him, the dealer. Kaito and Melinda settle in as the skeleton explains the rest of the rules. Basically, they were to compete to reach 21. With the rules laid out, Kaito says that he would bet some coins and try the game. The skeleton deals their cards. Currently, Kaito had a 2 and a face card, which was the equivalent of a 10, making a total of 12. As long as he didn't get a face card, it wouldn't be a bust. He asks for another card and ends up with a 6. With his current total being 18, Kaito makes the decision to stop. The skeleton's hand had 12 to begin with as well. Since it was below 17, it had to draw another one. Kaito celebrates as the dealer pulls out a face card. With a total of 22, the dealer's hand was a bust. The skeleton claps for Kaito, congratulating him on his win. Kaito and Melinda leave the table, the skeleton bowing again as it bids them farewell. Reuniting with the group, Gantz asks how it went. Kaito was sure it was perfectly safe, he just didn't know how to report it to the guildmaster. Time passes and eventually Kaito's party makes its way back to the guild hall. However, standing before an angered man, Kaito could only smile and tremble nervously. The man yells, asking if Kaito was serious about talking skeletons that didn't attack humans and an inn in the dungeon. Cowering in fear, Kaito tells the man that he wasn't joking at all. The man's eyes are sharp as he stares down Kaito. He was Kaito's uncle, but also the guildmaster, Gillen. Gillen says that it was already causing issues for guild operations since younger folk were constantly hanging out at the casino. But an even bigger problem was the hair oil being sold at the dungeon. It was becoming a rumor in other towns too. In a recent auction, one bottle sold for 10 gold coins. Kaito reasons that no matter how good the quality of the product was, it still wouldn't be worth all that much. The market price of the hair oil should be around 4 gold coins. Gillen tells him that it had become a target for speculation among the merchants. If prices went up with every resale, things were going to get out of hand. Kaito adds that the bathhouse was becoming a rumor among the locals as well. Soon, even townsfolk might flood the dungeon. Gillen says that if monsters were attacking people, they could restrict dungeon entry, but since there was no danger, it was hard to restrict them. However, a dungeon was a dungeon. Gillen says that even if they didn't attack, monsters had appeared in the dungeon and they couldn't just leave it be. Kaito flinches, asking if the guildmaster planned on conquering the dungeon. However, Gilla punches the nearest wall, saying that if that were possible, then he wouldn't be complaining. The other day, the lord's cousin's acquaintance or some noble's daughter came by just for the hair oil. If they crushed that place, they would be the target of criticism. Even merchants might complain too. Kaito internally laughs to himself, seeing how tough being a guildmaster was. However, they couldn't leave the problem alone if they wanted to enjoy the casino. Kaito goes quiet, deep in thought. After a while, Kaito suggests placing adventurers as guards in the casino dungeon. Gillen sighs, asking who would even pay for something like that and if anyone would even consider doing it for free. Kaito wonders if they would be able to monopolize the hair oil. If they're able to and they add a markup, they could use it to fund the security team. It would also justify the monopoly. Gillen asks if it was also a tactic to keep the merchants in check. Kaito says that since the place was still technically a dungeon, dungeon incidents weren't crimes. Gillen considers what it could mean for the kingdom law, but Kaito reminds him that dungeons were adventurer territory, so merchants meddling in was wrong. Not only that, if the guild sold it all at a fixed price, merchants should be able to benefit too. Kaito offers to prepare one bottle for smoothing things over with the nobles too. Gillen slowly agrees, but Kaito makes sure to remind him that violence was of course unacceptable. Gillen raises a hand to reassure him before he compliments Kaito, saying that he was better at coming up with diplomatic approaches than being an adventurer. Kaito's eyes brighten at his words, but his expression quickly drops when Gillen doubles down and says that he was second-rate as an adventurer. Meanwhile, Matarame sits back on his chair watching the surveillance monitors. Kerama celebrates that the renovations were a success. Matarame admits that he was relieved as well. However, stationing adventurers as guards in the casino was a rather unexpected move. He wonders if they should be a guard station for them. More importantly, however, Matarame wasn't expecting them to get more regulars staying at the lodging facilities. Kerama suggests that it was most likely because there was a medium-sized dungeon about an hour away from the casino, and the adventurers were using their inn as a base. Matarame admits that he had prepared the lodging area so the adventurers could enjoy the slot machines until late into that night, but he was surprised it was being used as an actual inn. He was glad that it was popular, but he frowns over a different problem. In one of the monitors, a large pile of coins was being displayed. Kerama asks if the accumulation of the silver coins was a problem. Matarame explains that money was meant to circulate and he had no plans on using them. If they kept hoarding silver coins like that, eventually a shortage would stage in the human world. The value of the currency in human society would change drastically. Since their casino coins were set based on the silver coins, it would eventually be a problem for them too. Matarame explains that the scary part about economics was that once a small distortion occurred, it would turn into a huge wave that couldn't be stopped at some point. Kerama asks if he was planning on just releasing the silver coins. Matarame disagrees as he reasons that there was a fear of their customer base changing if they made it so that coins could be exchanged for cash. His expression suddenly lights up as he wonders if they should try making a crane game. Kerama tilts his head, unaware what a crane game was in the first place. Another day, another time spent in Matarame's dungeon. Melinda looks around as they enter once more. Asel stretches sore from their adventures and happy at the idea of going for a bath. Melinda comments that she's thought about it before, but every day, the number of people visiting the dungeon kept increasing. As they walk, someone approaches Kaito. Kaito greets the man as Dan, currently working as one of the dungeon's newly appointed guards. Seeing as they were busy having a conversation, Melinda tells Kaito she was heading off to the baths first. Kaito asks Dan how his work has been going and if they've faced any problems. Dan reassures him that things have been fine and once his shift was over, he could even play in the casino. However, for whatever reason, the casino dungeon had built a guard station for them. It was fully furnished and some of the skeletons handled the cleaning. Kaito comments that he was jealous. Dan asks if he was staying over for the night again. Kaito disagrees, saying that he already stayed the night before, so he was heading back to Roadlock. It wasn't like he could stay there every day. Kaito says that he was just going to play the slots until the girls of their party finished with their bath. Dan teases him, saying that a real man played Blackjack. Kaito scoffs, saying that there were similar games to Blackjack outside of the dungeon, but the slot machines were something he could only get in the casino. Dan says that that wasn't enough to convince him. The both of them refuse to back down from their preferred games. Dan suddenly changes the subject and says that the hottest game in the casino at that moment was something called Hand the Money. Kaito sheepishly agrees that the game was out of his league. It was basically a crane game that used the low-level monster called Clay Hand to grab at coins. It cost 10 coins or 10,000 kraka to play. However, a person was limited to only one play per day. Dan asks if Kaito had tried it before, urging him to try it before heading out for the day. He laughs, saying that only the dungeon master of the casino would think of using such an annoying monster in a game like that. Kaito asks if Dan had obtained the black coin in the crane game. They both go quiet. Finally, Dan breaks out into a smile and says that if he had the black coin, he wouldn't be working there anymore. The crane game was filled with gold and silver coins. However, among them were unfamiliar coin colors like red, green, and yellow. They were meant to be winning coins that granted extra chances and more. Among those different colored coins was a single black coin. The black coin lets the winner take all the coins in the box. Obtaining it was every player's dream. Dan says that he saw a flyer saying that the dungeon was holding a special tournament soon with an enlarged clay hand. Kaito exclaims in disbelief. However, their conversation is cut short when someone yells at the blackjack table that he was being cheated. The adventurer claims that the skeleton had switched cards, so it should return his money. Dan and Kaito look incredulous as they listen in. They were fully aware that the casino lets customers win gradually, so it was more likely that the adventurer was trying to aim for a big win. However, the adventurer grit his teeth in anger. In the next second, he draws out his sword and slashes at the skeleton, cutting it in half. As he continues to lose his cool, Kaito tells Dan to stop the man, but Dan calms him down. He reminds Kaito not to be so reckless because they couldn't blame adventurers for killing monsters in a dungeon. Kaito leans forward and whispers to Dan, telling him to note the adventurer's name and report it to the guildmaster. After all, there had already been an announcement from the guild not to cause any trouble in the casino. Kinda crazy that Matarame's dungeon is probably the only dungeon being guarded and regulated like it's a natural part of the kingdom now. Dan whispers back to Kaito, calling the adventurer an idiot for thinking he could oppose the Roadlock Guildmaster's word. Meanwhile, Matarame watches the monitors with a content smile. The crane game was doing well, and at the rate they were going, the tournament they would be holding in the future should be a success. Kerama adds that with the crane game, manipulating the prizes from their side would be harder, and Matarame agrees. Currently, the slot machines were manipulated to hit wins more easily. He knew it would be a hassle when people lost big and got angry. Matarame reassures Kerama that statistically, a win should appear around the 300th person. Adventurers who actually saw someone winning would surely come back every day. Matarame asks how skeletons were destroyed for the day. Kerama tells him that there are currently none. The number was decreasing day by day. Matarame is relieved, saying that less trouble was good. Kerama says that the guards seem to be kicking out the troublemakers. With that, Matarame tells Kerama that they are finally going to put their next plan into action, but Kerama seems hesitant. Matarame asks if he was still against his idea, but Kerama tells him that it was simply because it was unheard of. Matarame reassures him that being a pioneer was an honor. Kerama asks who their mediator would be, turning to a monitor that was aimed at Kaito. Matarame tells Kerama that he was the right man for the job. Back at the guild hall, Gillen's booming voice is heard as he exclaims in disbelief that the dungeon had requested guild work. His face is incredulous as Kaito innocently holds up an envelope. Kaito explains that the night before, while he was staying at the dungeon inn, a skeleton had approached him with the letter and the job request. Taking the letter from Kaito, Gillen asks him if it was a request directly from the dungeon master. Gillen realizes that since the skeletons had intelligence, then they had autonomy as well. And with that, it meant they could hire too, so it was only normal in a sense. Reading through the letter, Gillen tells Kaito that the dungeon was recruiting a chef. There were additional details such as age and gender being irrelevant, a sturdy adventurer that could work live-in, and with cooking experience of more than 3 years preferably. Kaito tells Gillen that it was most likely for the dungeon restaurant that was still under preparation. Kaito agrees that despite the casino dungeon being safe thus far, he didn't want to eat food made by monsters. Gillen tells him that the idea of a dungeon was already weird from the very beginning. Kaito says that the request seemed reasonable. The conditions and the pay seemed good and the work environment sounded decent. According to the job request, the salary would be 300,000 kroka. Additionally, the chef would have 1 day off a week and possibly be promoted. Kaito reminds Gillen that the dungeon master could ask other guilds or sources for help. Immediately, Gillen explodes at Kaito, saying that he knew, and that was what made it frustrating for him. Finally, Gillen sighs and says it couldn't be helped. He already had someone in mind, a former adventurer in the name of Guki Nogarara. Nogarara finds himself on his way to the casino dungeon, practically cursing under his breath all the way. He couldn't believe he was being asked to work in a dungeon. Back then, he had beat up a noble who had complained about his food. It ended up ruining his shop as he drowned in debt. Thankfully, Gillen had taken on his debt for him. Until he repaid his debt, he had no choice but to follow Gillen's orders and work in the casino dungeon. He declares that once his debt was paid off, he was quitting immediately. However, upon arriving, he can only gape in shock. His face is incredulous as some female adventurers pass by fresh from their bath. He had heard rumors before, but he couldn't believe that he was in a dungeon. He suddenly remembered that adventurers were also dispatched from the guild and stationed in the dungeon. Turning to the side, he catches sight of an adventurer with a fiery aura surrounding him. The man seemed to be lit up with a red glow. Some people had certain aura levels: yellow for beginners, orange for intermediate, and red for advanced. Nogarara smirks to himself. He thought times had changed, but it seemed like there were still some capable people around. He approaches the adventurer and introduces himself as someone who was sent by Gillen. Understanding who he was, the guard leads him away. Suddenly, a skeleton approaches Nogarara, already expecting him. Nogarara is surprised for only a moment, but he understands that it was a puppet of the dungeon master. Nogarara tells it his purpose for coming and asks if the skeleton was the dungeon master himself, to which the skeleton agrees. Nogarara is struck quiet for a moment. He couldn't help but think how he had once been a renowned adventurer, and now he was being employed by a monster. Gesturing further into the dungeon, the skeleton offers to show Nogarara his workplace. Nogarara figured that a kitchen in a dungeon must be filthy like a garbage dump. With Gillen telling him to work in a dungeon and witnessing a monster trying to hire an adventurer, he found it all so infuriating. If he had to work in a place like this, he would rather take things into his own hands. He slowly grips the battle axe strapped to his back. However, the skeleton turns to him and motions for him to enter a room. Nogarara flinches in shock as he realizes they had arrived at the kitchen. Nogarara is struck silent as he's presented with an almost sparkling grand kitchen area. The skeleton boasts that the kitchen was equipped with over 10 magical tool stoves and 4 extra-large ovens installed. Pushing a large set of double doors on the side of the kitchen area, the skeleton leads him to the food storage. Nogarara steps in and is shocked to find an ice chamber. He had heard of devices that used magic tools to create ice and chill food, but something of that scale was only for high nobles or wealthy merchants. Holding up one of the stored tomatoes, Nogarara marvels at how fresh the ingredients were. The skeleton comes up behind him and asks if there was anything lacking in terms of his facilities. Nogarara awkwardly admits that there was none. He turns to the skeleton and says that while the facilities were all accounted for, he wanted to know how the shop would be managed. He didn't want the skeletons and the dungeon master meddling into his work too much. The skeleton says that mornings aside, he was free to operate relatively freely in the evenings. The only condition was that Nogarara needed to provide delicious food at reasonable prices. Nogarara reassures him that it was only natural that he wouldn't make bad food and he wouldn't overcharge or sell anything cheap. Pleased by his answer, the skeleton thanks him. Nogarara notes that the skeleton had said mornings aside and asks what they planned to do for breakfast. The skeleton says that they were planning on making it a buffet, but Nogarara was unfamiliar with the term. The skeleton explains that it was a cafeteria where users were free to take whatever food they liked. Nogarara exclaims at the idea, realizing the skeleton was talking about an all-you-can-eat. He argues that with adventurers whose bodies were their capital, the food would disappear in no time. However, the skeleton calmly retorts that responding to customer requests was also part of the job. Its words make Nogarara go quiet. When he was young, Nogarara was always hungry too. He even had comrades who died hungry. Now that he thought about it, he wanted to let the younger adventurers eat their fill. Nogarara tells the skeleton that it couldn't sell the service for cheap. The skeleton agrees and says that instead they would set the breakfast buffet at a rate of 1 silver coin or 1,000 kroka. Nogarara couldn't help but think that even if it was an all-you-can-eat, the price was rather expensive for breakfast. The skeleton suddenly chimes in and adds that the breakfast buffet would be free for guests staying in the dungeon inn. With all that in order, Nogarara accepts the terms and shakes the skeleton's hand, agreeing to work in the dungeon kitchens. Meanwhile, flyers for the soon-to-open casino hotel were being passed around. Reading through the flyer, Seal wonders what the dungeon was planning this time around. From beside her and reading a similar flyer in hand, Melinda exclaims in disbelief. The flyer contained details of renting the hotel for a month. A single room cost $90,000 while a triple room went as high as $250,000 per room. She found it expensive, especially since the standard rent in Roadlock starts from 50,000 kroka. Reading over his own flyer, Kaito notes that they were allowed to check the rooms for themselves. Seeing them approach, the skeleton greets Kaito by name. Kaito's eyes brighten to hear that the skeletons knew him personally. From behind him, Melinda laughs at him for being too happy that they recognized him. Kaito asks the skeleton about touring the new hotel, and they're led away to check the amenities. They're shown a room that was more fit to be called an apartment. The party goes around and inspect the area, finding it rather nice to live in. Seal notes that there was even a stove and a faucet where they could make tea. Treff comments that the private rooms were quite nice too. The skeleton giving them a tour informs them that if they signed a contract, a skeleton would clean their room once daily. However, they're requested to keep their valuables in the safe during that time. Kaito knew that the hotel was still a bit out of his reach. He agrees that it was certainly a room worth the price, however. As he continues to explore the room, he catches sight of some paper on the table. Picking one up, he asks the skeleton what it was. It was a breakfast ticket. The skeleton tells him that the hotel would prepare breakfast at the restaurant for guests who stayed. The skeleton adds that the breakfast was a buffet. They would prepare the meals on a large table and the guests could take whatever they liked and as much as they wished to eat. At his words, Gantz appears behind the skeleton and asks again if it was really going to be an all-you-can-eat. The skeleton rather nervously confirms that several types of bread, egg dishes, meat dishes, salad and fruits would be served, not to mention soups and juices. Immediately, the entire party gapes in awe at the very idea. As for the taste, they guaranteed it was the same quality as served in other restaurants rumored to be above average in price. Melinda asks if only hotel guests could try it, but the skeleton reassures her that any visitor would be able to for a flat rate of 1,000 kroka. Kaito thinks that if it was an all-you-can-eat, it was certainly not a ripoff. Although spending 1,000 kroka just for breakfast was still a bit much. He turns to Gantz to ask for his opinion. However, his head was already spinning at the thought of an all-you-can-eat buffet. Kaito could practically see in his eyes that he was blinded by the thought of meat. Turning back to the skeleton, he asks if there were any rooms available. Time passes and Kaito takes a sip of his tea. However, his calm is short-lived as he all but slams his teacup back down. He realizes he was being too comfortable. He wanted to make the dungeon his base instead of Roadlock. At the moment, he was spending time at the Dungeon Cafe. While the restaurant operated during the mornings and evenings, the cafe operated throughout the day. However, Kaito couldn't relax and he slouched into his seat. Items he obtained in the dungeon had to be sold and he would need to show his face at the guild eventually. He moans in complaint, wishing that the dungeon had a buyback shop in place. At his own words, he stops short. In the next second, he gets up in a frenzy. He yells that they just needed to build a buyback shop in the dungeon. However, he realizes in the next second that he was too loud, disrupting the other patrons of the cafe. He quickly apologizes and sits back down. Slowly, he realizes that a buyback shop wouldn't be enough. They needed weapons and armor too, so they would need a workshop. They'd even have to call in merchants too. His adrenaline soon leaves him as he realizes that one buyback shop would be too simple. At the scale of the dungeon, it would practically be a small town. As he's struggling to think of a solution, he stops again. He thinks of the idea of setting up a guild branch office in the dungeon itself. With a nervous smile, Kaito wonders if he should talk to his uncle and the Roadlock Guildmaster Gillen about the idea. If he succeeds, Kaito could actually be a sponsor of the casino dungeon at this rate. Meanwhile, Matarame flinches as someone knocks at the door to his room. He turns to find a skeleton with Kerama on hand. Kerama had brought in a report. Matarame apologizes as Kerama could have waited to get it sorted the next day. However, Kerama says that he wanted to show Matarame one more thing. He tells him that according to the report, the casino operations were proceeding smoothly overall. The breakfast buffet was particularly popular, although they did run out of ingredients. Matarame reassures him that it was fine since the ingredients were fairly common, so they didn't cost much in terms of points. They could recover the cost just from the stay duration. Kerama agrees before shifting the subject and congratulating Matarame. With a proud smile, Kerama announces that the daily net points they gained has exceeded 10,000 points. Matarame asks what he means, and Kerama reassures him that it was wonderful news, since there were only a handful of dungeon masters who gained 10,000 points per day within 6 months. However, Matarame sighs in dismay. At the current time, they were at a dead end. About 70 to 80% of Roadlock's adventurers had already come to the casino. It was good that they had achieved rapid growth in half a year, but if they were at their limit, all that's left was gradual decline. If they made 10,000 a day, that would be 3.6 million a year, meaning it would still take them 3,000 years to earn 100 billion points. Kerama reminds Matarame that as long as the dungeon core wasn't destroyed, Matarame wouldn't die. Matarame lets out a short laugh, saying that the casino wouldn't last that long. Eventually, people's tastes would change and similar facilities would appear. They needed at least 10 times or maybe even 50 times more customers than they did now. Meanwhile, in a place called the Grand Hall, a council is gathered. A man in glasses raises the information to the rest that a rookie dungeon master named Matarame was rapidly increasing his points. Another council member had heard Matarame makes his visitors pay a high fee just to open the door. Another man complains that if that was true, he was acting against the principles of a dungeon. A woman turns to someone called Dogoskara, informing him that Matarame had never killed a single person to this day. Dogoskara frowns at the news, calling Matarame a pathetic dungeon master. Someone commented that it was almost a year since Matarame started his dungeon. At the head of the council, a woman is quiet for a moment. Finally, she declares that Matarame was to be summoned for an inquiry hearing. A man walks into the casino dungeon and immediately catches the eye of multiple people. They greet him happily and with open arms without hesitation. With neatly styled blonde hair and a well-tailored red jacket, he was a man of means named Jake. However, internally, Jake couldn't help but wonder what expressions the people around him would all make if they knew that his true identity was the casino's dungeon master, none other than Matarame. He had started occasionally visiting the casino floor using that form, possessing a humanoid puppet. It was a nice change of pace for him, too. As he walks past the slot machines, a woman calls out to him. Jake greets the woman as Alessandra, complimenting her for her beauty. Alessandra is pleased by his words, hiding her laughter behind a newly manicured hand. Noticing her nail color, Jake recognizes them as the new prize available for exchange, and he compliments Alessandra again, saying they suited her. She rushes up to him with a bright smile, happy that he noticed how she finally obtained them. Jake or Matarame's purpose for walking down the casino floors was information gathering and research. By interacting with adventurers on the floor like how he was doing, he could obtain raw information. Fluttering her eyelashes at him, Alessandra invites Jake out to dinner. He smoothly agrees but informs her that he wouldn't be able to that very night because another girl named Minchia had already invited him. At his words, Alessandra whines out loud that Minchia had beaten her again. She couldn't understand what was so great about her. As she stomps away, Jake fixes his coat and lets out a sigh of relief. Unbeknownst to everyone else, Minchia was another temporary form he controlled. It wasn't like he had a cross-dressing hobby or anything, but instead Minchia was created for him to freely research women's needs. Her existence was also convenient in times like this. Jake heads over to the bar and chooses his drink. As the bartender prepares his choice, he asks her for any interesting stories. He smiles pleasantly to himself. He didn't just come there for drinks. Instead, what he truly wanted was information about the current world. He's heard quite a few during his time there. There was a massive hole somewhere in the world that went all the way to the abyss. There was said to be a tower reaching the heavens, created by the gods. And there was even a world tree as large as a mountain range. 1,000 years ago, there was supposedly even something called a mythical war. But he still wasn't sure if it was true or not. Jake takes a sip of his drink, and when he lowers it, the bartender offers a story about those who challenged the 8 Great Dungeons. The 8 Great Dungeons was the collective name for the 8 world-famous dungeons known as Unconquerable. Jake jokes that there were always fools in every era who challenged the 8 Great Dungeons, but the bartender says that the current rumor was that the dungeons might finally be conquered. Jake blinks in shock. The bartender continues as she wipes down a glass. According to the rumors, there were about 4 people capable of clearing the Great Dungeons. First was the mighty swordsman Sigurd. He became a legend from a certain tournament after he effortlessly sliced a giant iron ball, larger than himself, in half. He was currently attempting to conquer the Black Dragon dungeon. Second was the phantom assassin, Yogiri. No one had ever seen his true form. The only proof of his existence was the left-behind heads of his targets he had decapitated. He was currently attempting to conquer the malevolent Blade dungeon. Third was the Witch of Ashes, Altair Vermilion. She was a genius from the magic city of Gondoranov. While it's believed that class level 7 and above magic couldn't be cast alone, it was said that she was able to cast class level 8 magic alone at the mere age of 10. She was currently attempting to conquer the Dungeon of the Crimson Lotus. And finally, fourth was the Saint of the Salvation Church, Treftiana. She was a woman recognized as a saint by the Salvation Church for the first time in 100 years. She possessed exceptional healing powers and was said to be able to regenerate even lost limbs. She was currently attempting to conquer the dungeon of the Celestial Maiden. Hearing the story of the 8 great dungeons and the rumored 4 challengers, Jake smiles to himself, intrigued. He thanks the bartender for the stories and asks for the best drink in the bar. As a bonus, the bartender tells him the story of the divine sword Mion. According to the rumors, it was a sword that no force or boast could draw from the ground, and only a hero recognized by the gods could wield it. Shifting his drink around, Jake thinks about the gods of the current world. After that, for about 2 hours, he drank at the bar and listened to various stories from adventurers. Lately, the hottest topic was all about the town being built near the casino dungeon. With the guild branch construction underway, other facilities were being built, and it was starting to look like a little town already. Retreating to his own room, Jake lies down on the bed and releases his possession of the puppet body. In a blink of an eye, Matarame was back in his own body. He stretches, finding his original body far more comfortable. He exits the room with a spring in his step. Out of everything he's heard, however, the most surprising thing was that the one who suggested the casino dungeon town was none other than Kaito, the first adventurer to visit. Kaito, you amazing bastard. You were actually able to pull it off. Upon leaving the room, Matarame runs into a maid he calls Maria. He asks her how things are going, but instead of speaking, she only nods her head. Maria was a monster Matarame had created. However, she wasn't alive. She was a zombie, a literal moving corpse. Matarame tells her that the clothes and cosmetics they made were popular, but it was only expected of the prize development department she was a part of. Matarame tells her that he wanted to check the next projects, and Maria nods again as she leads him down the halls. Maria had been given intelligence and vocal cords, but she rarely opened her mouth. Matarame figured it was part of her personality as well. They reach the room for prize development and he knocks on the door. He announces his arrival to 2 more maids named Melia and Aaliyah, who immediately turn to him upon his arrival. Maria alone wasn't enough manpower for the prize development department, so he created Melia and Aaliyah. Matarame sure does like names ending in A, huh? Jake is literally the only one of his creations without his name ending in A. Matarame had changed the maids' hairstyles from one another because it became troublesome for him to tell them apart. Maria had the shortest hairstyle, followed by Melia, with Aaliyah having the longest hair. He tells Melia that the nail polish she made was popular. The clothes Aaliyah designed were also well received, however they were so popular that he saw people here and there wearing the exact same clothes. He asks Aaliyah to add some color variations or small changes even for the same items. Aaliyah nods her head in understanding. Matarame smiles awkwardly to himself. Although the zombie maids didn't show much emotion, they were still able to listen properly. He turns back to Maria and asks to see the new products. He's presented with perfume bottles and lipsticks and nail polish. He double-checks with Maria that the ingredients they used weren't toxic to humans, to which she nods her head. He's heard that old cosmetics use things like poisons and minerals. However, he couldn't risk that. If the cosmetics proved poisonous, the casino dungeon could be seen as a dangerous one and easily become a target for conquest. Finishing up, he asked the zombie maids to let him know if there was anything lacking in their work before heading out again. In the surveillance room, Kerama turns around at the sound of the door opening. He greets Matarame happily as he returns. Kerama suddenly tells Matarame he had something to discuss with him, piquing Matarame's curiosity as the furball had suddenly taken on a more formal tone. Kerama bows as he congratulates Matarame for his anniversary since becoming a dungeon master. However, regarding that, Kerama brought both good news and bad news. Matarame laughs lightly as it was the first time he's been told the phrase. For the good news, Kerama tells him that because Matarame was able to survive as a dungeon master for a year, he gained the right to enter and exit the Dungeon Society. The Dungeon Society was a shared dungeon where dungeon masters could gather. Masters who survived 1 year could install a dedicated transfer circle to come and go within the society. Matarame notes that it was his first time hearing of such a place, and Kerama explains that it was a rule not to tell him until a year had passed. After all, there were many masters who didn't get to survive a full year or were possibly preyed on by newcomers. Matarame asks what the society was for, and Kerama explains that it was mainly a social place for exchanging information, but they could also buy and sell monsters. Kerama adds that Matarame could also use points to purchase land within the society. At his words, Matarame thinks of the possibility of opening a second branch of the casino dungeon. Kerama says that Matarame could also lend and borrow points, much to Matarame's shock. Kerama says that it was possible but difficult at the current time. There seemed to be a screening process and collateral required for lending. Apparently, the collateral would be his casino dungeon itself. If repayment was delayed and it went to forced execution, the dungeon was carved up and converted into points. Matarame comments on the harsh collection method. Kerama explains that the conversion rate for a carved-up dungeon was 1/10 of the amount used to create it. It meant that to repay 10 points, a dungeon created with 100 points gets carved up. If things ended badly, Matarame could lose most of his dungeon. On the other hand, lenders also had their own risks to think of. If the borrower's dungeon gets conquered, collection becomes impossible. Kerama finished off his explanation by saying that the Dungeon Society was a good place for Matarame to interact with others as long as he was careful. Having heard all that, Matarame decides to set up the transfer circle right away. However, Kerama calls him to attention one more time, reminding him that he hadn't informed him of the bad news yet. Holding out an envelope, Kerama says that a summons had arrived. Matarame had been summoned to the inquest. Apparently, he had been accused of problems with dungeon management. There were 8 dungeon masters currently accusing him. They were the dungeon masters of the Grand Eighth. Matarame already knew who the Grand Eight were, the pinnacle and rulers of all dungeon masters. It was the collective term for the masters who governed over the 8 great dungeons. Sitting at the top was the Silver Dungeon with a total of 220 million points. Second was the Dungeon of the Insect Venom with a total of 190 million points. The Black Dragon Dungeon with 180 million points. The Allure Dungeon with 140 million points. The Dungeon of Desire with 140 million points as well. Dungeon of the Celestial Maiden with 120 million points. The Malevolent Blade Dungeon with 110 million points. And finally, the Dungeon of the Crimson Lotus with 109 million points. They were a bunch of dungeons and masters with at least over 100 million points each to their name. Now that he thought about it, he didn't know how many points he currently had. Kerama tells him that he currently had around 4 million points. Matarame hums to himself, wondering what the Grand Eight were doing, picking a fight with an inferior opponent who was 2 whole digits below them. Kerama goes quiet and Matarame awkwardly smiles to himself. After all, they were just a dungeon that hasn't killed a single person. He laughs at himself because it is obviously nothing but problems. Kerama says that although the pretexts would vary, the main issue was probably the daily points he's gained. The casino dungeon averaged to 10,000 points per day. There weren't even 50 masters who earned that much in a day. Even the highest-ranking one Silver Dungeon had its highest daily point gain at only 300,000. Matarame sighs to himself as he realizes that he was most likely seen as an eyesore they couldn't stand, and/or a nail that stuck out that needed to be hammered down. He asks Kerama when the inquest was, and Kerama informs him that it would be tomorrow at noon. If he chose to ignore it, the summons had a compulsory effect just in case. Matarame complains that he wasn't even given time to prepare, but he knew if he went on the inquest without a plan, he would just be made a fool of. Calling out to Kerama, Matarame says they needed to devise a strategy. Meanwhile, someplace else, a lone figure was quickly making its escape. A man sobbed and breathed heavily, his face bloodied and bruised, and he couldn't but think over and over that everyone with him was already dead. Their party, a promising new group of adventurers, had conquered several dungeons and finally chose to challenge the 8 great dungeons. Their first was the Dungeon of the Black Dragon. The middle layers were nothing special and their party cleared them with ease. They laughed, thinking that the 8 great dungeons were only at that level. But things didn't stay that way for long. Their party was annihilated in a single battle. A monstrous creature with a black aura. Auras became denser in color as it grew stronger. Black was said to be the endpoint of an aura. At some point, the man could only cower behind a tree as the enemy loomed ever closer. He knew there was no way they could have won against something like it. Eventually, the monstrous creatures reached him. His last thoughts before his head was inevitably cut off was how he shouldn't have been involved with the 8 great dungeons. Back in the casino dungeon, Matarame holds onto a sheet of paper with a magic circle. He bids Kerama goodbye, who wishes him good luck in turn. It was time for him to go to the inquiry hearing where the Grand Eight were waiting for him. The paper in his hands began to glow as the transportation magic circle was activated. At the Dungeon Society, Matarame's form materializes into being at the center of the Grand Hall. Gazing upwards, he sees multiple figures sitting atop tall thrones looking down at him. He smirks as he immediately recognizes who they were. It was the 8. A voice declares the beginning of the inquest. Matarame had some information from some preliminary investigations. The one speaking at the moment was the chairman of the Grand Eight and dungeon master of the Silver Dungeon, Sylvana. With a cold voice, she urges the accused to state his name. However, calmly, Matarame asks who they were accusing. Sylvana says that it was obviously him, but Matarame says that he couldn't answer that because he was no criminal. Finally having enough, a dragon-like figure yells at Matarame, warning him to mind his tongue. He reminds Matarame that they had been the Grand Eight since before he was even born. A cold-looking man wearing glasses scoffs, saying that Matarame's mouth was the only thing fully grown about him. Matarame recognized the rest of them. At the third seat, the dragon-like figure was Dogoscara of the Dungeon of the Black Dragon. At the second seat, Megwire of the Dungeon of the Insect Venom. Matarame calmly reminds them that he was currently at an inquiry hearing. That means it was supposed to be a place to investigate if a crime had been committed, not to pass judgment. A figure currently curling her eyelashes casually says that Matarame had some nerve to run his mouth when he didn't understand his own place. It was the fourth seat, Enmi of the Allure Dungeon. Munching on bread, a man agrees with Enmi, saying that the moment he was called to an inquiry hearing, he was already deemed guilty. Matarame calmly smiles and asks what crime was he guilty of when he was clearly complying with the dungeon rules. Angered by his words, Sylvana tells him to stop messing around when demanding high fees for opening the doors to his dungeon went against the very principles of what they stood for. A girl laughs behind her fan, reminding Matarame that he still hadn't killed a single person. It was the sixth seat, Yulin of the Dungeon of the Celestial Maiden. Another man calls Matarame pathetic after hearing Yulin's words. It was the seventh seat, Judah of the Malevolent Blade Dungeon. A man with a scarred face adds that Matarame was a disgrace to dungeon masters. Finally, it was the eighth seat, Cain of the Dungeon of the Crimson Lotus. Matarame points out that the dungeon rules didn't have a rule that said he had to kill people. Sylvana tells him that the Grand Eight did not recognize that exception, and Matarame laughs, saying that he didn't need their recognition anyway, balls of steel this one. At this words, Dogoscara is lit with rage, declaring that he was going to kill him. Following close behind, all the other dungeon masters emit their own terrifying aura. Matarame is struck in fear for a moment, however he quickly recovers himself. He states that only as expected of the Grand Eight, he was undoubtedly the weakest in the room. However, he reminds them that dungeon masters were immortal, so as long as the dungeon core wasn't destroyed, he won't die either. Megwire mocks him for his shallow thinking. He tells Matarame that if he couldn't die, then they just needed to imprison him for life. Maintaining a cool head, Matarame tells them to do as they pleased. The body he was currently inhabiting was a mere puppet, as he didn't trust them enough to come there with his main body. Yulin grins darkly and calls him a foolish child because it was only natural for them to anticipate as much. She happily informs him that the barrier cast on the handrail he was standing in traps the spirit of the possessed person. Matarame's spirit was never going to be able to return to his own body ever again. She announces with glee that Matarame was now their captive candy, and all that was left was for them to use magic to torment his spirit. Licking her lips in delight, she wonders what kind of cries he would treat them to. Oh, she's that kind of person. Egging him on, Yulin asks if he was already scared. Cain suddenly speaks up, saying that there was no need for Yulin to trouble herself, and Judah instead offers to handle Matarame's torture. Their conversation is broken when Matarame suddenly laughs, much to the surprise of the others. He apologizes for interrupting their fun, but he informs them that his spirit was not possessing the puppet he was currently using since he anticipated they would pull something like that. He explains that he was remotely controlling the puppet with a special magic tool, meaning his spirit was still with his current body and not in the dungeon society with them. From the looks of it, he's wearing something like virtual reality gear. So I guess technology wins over magic? At his words, Dogoscara is angered again, calling him a coward for sending a mere puppet. Matarame brushes his words off, saying that he didn't want to hear it from people like them who tried to pressure a mere rookie. Carrying on with his summons, he says that if it was regarding the symbols that opened the doors to his dungeon, he could ease it to an extent if they were willing to accept his conditions. Sylvana blinks in surprise at his words. Dogoscara screams again, offended that a newcomer like him thought he was at their level enough to make demands. Sylvana tells Dogoscara to calm down and they would hear out Matarame's conditions. Internally, Matarame was glad that Sylvana was so calm. So far, everything was as he predicted. However, from here on out, it was a gamble for him. Matarame's conditions were to have his casino dungeon be connected to their dungeons via a transportation magic circle. The Grand Eight looked at him dumbfounded, wondering if such a thing was even possible. Matarame reassures them it was possible since the dungeon society in itself was a dungeon already. It was the same principle as connecting their dungeons to the society. However, Megwire says that his idea was ridiculous. His proposal was interesting, but they had no need to connect to his dungeon. He reminds Matarame that they were the Grand Eight, making their ranks, and his entirely different. To connect the dungeons, several contracts were needed, but Matarame was not trustworthy, so they couldn't sign a contract with someone like him. Matarame agrees that Megwire made a fair point. Instead, he would offer something else. He was willing to bet his dungeon core. Sylvana and the rest flinch in shock. Dogoscara asks him if he understood what he was saying. Waging his dungeon core meant staking his own life, but Matarame reassures them he knew what he was doing. Matarame says that if either of their side breaks the promise, the person would pay a penalty based on points. He offers that the payment amount be his total of points. Sylvana goes quiet as she thinks about his offer. Matarame's dungeon didn't even have 10 million points even when estimated generously. Matarame asks for her thoughts, adding that he would withdraw if they thought it was impossible under his conditions. Sylvana knows that the moment Matarame violates the conditions, he would die, but for the rest of the Grand Eight, it wasn't much of an expense. Finally, Sylvana agrees, much to Dogodgara's shock. She asks where he planned on placing the transportation magic circles. Matarame offers to put them in a spot next to the entrance. If they install the transfer circle, he agrees to easing the conditions for the doors leading deeper into his dungeon. Since the cost right now was 200,000 coins for both, he would lower it to 1,000 each. During his brainstorming session for the inquest, Kerama had suggested that Matarame negotiate the price of the door, leading deeper all the way down to 1,000 coins. Kerama was sure that they would accept the conditions. Matarame agreed, saying that there weren't any fools who wouldn't accept such a deal. However, now at the inquest, Dogodgara tries to order Matarame to make the entrance free. Gotta give him credit for the sheer audacity. Matarame keeps a pleasant smile on his face even as he feels his anger spike, calling Dogodgara a musclehead internally. He clears his throat and says that it wouldn't be possible. Since it was a gateway to the dungeon's depths, he couldn't allow it to be set at such a low price. Finally, Sylvana announces that they accept his conditions. Dogodgara demands to know why they were accepting Matarame's conditions, but Meguiar tells him to calm down. He points out that once the conditions were eased, Matarame's dungeon would be conquered immediately. Dogodgara could only groan in dismay. Matarame asks if the hearing was over if they had nothing more to discuss. Sylvana purses her lips, almost annoyed but unable to say anything. Instead, she raises a hand and declares the hearing adjourned. At the casino dungeon, a large group had gathered. Kaito pushes his way past all the visitors, trying to pass through and Seal catches sight of him. She quickly informs him that a huge passage had appeared next to the entrance, much to Kaito's shock. Kaito says that they heard from Dan and he quickly asks if anyone had gone inside and if Gillen was informed. Following close behind, Askel reports that Gantz and Treff had entered to investigate and she had sent a telegram to Gillen. Kaito tells everyone to get out for now as he and Melinda enter the passage. Upon entering, Kaito finds that it was a room leading to 8 smaller rooms. He enters one of them and calls out to Gantz and Treff. Treff calls him further inside to look at something. On the ground was a complex magic circle. Melinda informs him that it was a transportation magic circle. Gantz tells him that he tried using it just now, and Kaito asks in a frenzy what happened and whether it was connected deeper into the dungeon. However, before Gantz could answer, the magic circle begins to light up. The group watches as a party materializes in front of them. At the forefront, a man asks who Kaito and the rest were, but Kaito was just as confused as to who they were since they didn't look like adventurers from Roadlock. Not only that, but the aura they emitted was clearly far above their party's level. Kaito finally speaks up and informs them that they were at the casino dungeon. The party is confused because as far as he knew, they were at the silver dungeon. Kaito blinks in surprise at his words before things suddenly click for him. Turning back to the main passage of the 8 rooms, Kaito watches as more adventurers emerge from the other rooms. Some from the dungeon of the Celestial Maiden, another from the Black Dragon dungeon, and the others from the dungeon of the Insect Venom. Melinda and Kaito come to the same conclusion. 8 rooms, each with a transportation circle. The rooms were connected to the 8 great dungeons. Kaito laughs nervously as he realizes that the guild branch construction was all back to square one. He quickly gathers himself back up as he realizes that someone needed to take charge of the confusion, and all that responsibility fell onto him. Amidst the confused adventurers, Kaito calls out to them to gain their attention. Eventually, time passes. At Matarame's surveillance room, Kerama happily congratulates him again. The points they acquired the day before had exceeded 200,000, and it was likely that they would achieve it again today. 3 weeks had passed since he connected the 8 great dungeons to his casino dungeon via the transportation magic circles. At that point, his daily points had increased 20 times. Kerama commends him for handling the inquest so masterfully, as he thought about doing everything while navigating through the hearing. Matarame agrees that it ended up benefiting him the most. Thanks to the Grand Eight taking the gamble, high-rank adventurers were flowing into his dungeon. The adventurers were enjoying the amenities of his casino. Kerama says that if rumors spread that anyone could challenge the 8 great dungeons from there, adventurers would surely gather from surrounding countries as well. Matarame adds that it was only going to get even busier. If they don't expand soon, the people wouldn't be able to fit inside. He tells Kerama that Maria and the others had already reported that they couldn't keep up with prize replenishment. Kerama agrees to increase prize replication machines and to assign 2 skeletons each to assist Maria and the other zombie maids. Regarding the symbols for the doors, Kerama says that even if the visitors had already noticed the price drop, there was still no sign of them being used. Matarame explains that nowadays the casino dungeon was the functional center of the town. As long as no clear danger emerged, neither the guild nor the merchants would allow it to be conquered. It was a fact the Grand Eight couldn't understand. Changing the subject, Kerama tells Matarame that one of their items currently under development required a lot of points. Looking at one of the monitors, it showed a skeleton shielding itself from a strong burst of flames. Matarame reassures Kerama that he doesn't mind. He tells him to ignore that profitability and to proceed as planned. Kerama points out that they needed to save up points, but Matarame says it was a necessary step. Although his dungeon was currently doing well, now that they were connected to the 8 great dungeons, the problem was whether they could hold out, and which of them would be the first to fall. Beyond that point, only hell waited for them.